Welcome to Newcastle Family History Society podcasts. The Newcastle Family History Society, located on Awabakal land in Newcastle, New South Wales, Australia, provides support for those interested in family history. This podcast is an audio extract from a presentation given by Dr. Jude Conway at the Society's Female Convicts of the Hunter Valley seminar in March 2025. Transported at just 19 years of age for a minor crime, Elizabeth Hannell's journey from a London servant girl to a foundational figure in Newcastle's colonial history is one of resilience, reinvention and raw determination. Through hardship, scandal and strength, Elizabeth forged a legacy not only through her own tenacity but through the public service of her children, who rose to become mayors, magistrates and pioneers of Newcastle society. Join Jude Conway as she reveals the life of Elizabeth Hannell, a mother of Newcastle.
Okay, so Elizabeth Hannell. Firstly, I'd also like to pay my respects to the original owners of the unceded Awabakal land we're on, who are sadly invisible in my talk, although they would have been around at the time. Also, I pay special tribute to the research of Del Foster, who is 3 times great-granddaughter of Elizabeth Hannell, who has done most of the work for her. There's an article in They Sent Me North, the publication about Elizabeth. It's got both our names on, but a lot of the work in that article was done by her. Now, Elizabeth Hannell, we think, was born in November about 1792, in the county of Berkshire, which I've discovered is where Windsor Castle is, and fairly close to London. All we know of her childhood is that she didn't learn to write. As a teenager, Elizabeth was employed by the Maxons in Portman Square in what was then called Marylebone, now Marylebone, in the county of Middlesex, which is now part of Greater London. Mrs. Maxon took in washing and Elizabeth assisted her. Now, on 30th of April, 1811, Elizabeth asked if she could borrow 6pence. Not having any change, Mrs. Maxon gave her a £2 note to go to the baker's. But the teenager must have been so thrilled to have so much money in her possession that she did not return. The Maxons naturally reported the theft to the police, and when taken into custody soon afterwards, the easily apprehended Elizabeth confessed she'd spent the money on, she bought a couple of pair of stockings and she'd hired a coach to go somewhere. Meagre benefits in comparison to the punishment. So on the 29th of May, 1811, at the Old Bailey, Elizabeth Hannell was found guilty of so-called grand licensing and sentenced to 7 years transportation to the colony of New South Wales. She wasn't yet 19. Elizabeth was confined in the overcrowded Newgate prison, and I have learnt while preparing this talk that it was usually only male convicts who were imprisoned in the hulks. So she probably remained in Newgate for almost a year before she and 126 other female convicts were taken down the Thames to board the Minstrel, which set sail on the 4th of June 1812 from Portsmouth. Now, when I was reading about the trip, so the ship reached Rio de Janeiro on the 29th of July, which sort of confused me because I wasn't quite sure which route the ship had taken. But it seems it must have been to do with currents and winds, that was one of the stopovers, because I don't think the Minstrel stopped at Cape Town with my record. And so it crisscrossed the South Atlantic Ocean, sailed round the Cape of Good Hope, and arrived in Port Jackson on the 25th of October, 1812, a short time before Elizabeth's 20th birthday. 3 days later, Elizabeth and the other female convicts from the Minstrel who hadn't yet been assigned were taken 20 miles up the river, and they were installed in the female factory, which was then the top floor of the male prison. It was a wool and linen factory, a pseudo-labour exchange, and marriage agency. And the women worked in the factory by day and some of them slept there at night. Elizabeth took up with James Walton, a 6 foot tall, muscular constable and scourger who whipped recalcitrant convicts when he was ordered. Elizabeth herself was 5 foot 4.5, which was actually, now it's about below average. But at that time, when you read the size, if you go through, they said more, a lot of women were under 5 feet. So she would have been fairly tall for her time. She had flaxen coloured hair, hazel eyes, and a fair to ruddy complexion. Now, Walton, he was born in Lancashire and he had been a Coldstream guard before being found guilty of theft, and he was transported to New South Wales for life. In December 1813, Elizabeth gave birth to a son who was named James Walton and baptised at St John's Church of England in Parramatta. She bore 2 more sons to James Walton, one in 1815, who was baptised John Walton, and the third, Jessie Walton. They also appear to have had a daughter, Mary, in about 1820, but she disappears from the records. The couple never married, possibly because Walton had a wife and children back in England, though, as you all probably know, that didn't stop other people getting married in the colony. Now, Elizabeth's 7-year sentence would have expired in May 1818, and I haven't seen any certificate of freedom. But in mid-1820, described as Walton's woman of Parramatta, so presumably Steve Walton, she became involved in an attempted scam to other convicts. For 3 days, the trio were observed hanging around a public house near the government commissariat store. Their behaviour and possibly their conversation led the publican to believe they were involved in something fishy. So he voiced his suspicions to the police, who duly arrested the 3. And after a trial at the Sydney Criminal Court, James Garland, James Smith, and Elizabeth Hannell were all found guilty of involvement in forging commissariat store receipts. But don't we love the fact that they steal and get involved with the law, because it means they're much easier to trace, and we find records in the newspapers of the day. Anyway, Garland was executed while Smith and Hannell received life sentences to be served in Newcastle. They were transported here on the 60-ton brig HMS Princess Charlotte on the 27th of July, 1820. And after offloading Hannell and Smith, amongst others, the Princess Charlotte sailed to Hobart, then headed back to Sydney and was never seen again. It had been built in Newcastle. Now, in Newcastle at the time, there was a population of 954. 52 children were living in Newcastle, but conditions were still very harsh, which could be why Elizabeth Hannell did not take her sons with her, even though the youngest, Jessie, would have only been 2 or 3, or she was not allowed. But with females only 10% of the population, it is not surprising that on the 10th of May, 1821, a daughter was born to Elizabeth Hannell and to a convict named John White, who, having a common name, is hard to pin down. On 9th of September, their baby was baptised Mary Ann White at Christchurch, presumably by the Church of England Reverend George Augustus Middleton, who had been appointed to Newcastle in December 1820. John White seems to have died sometime later. After the penal settlement was relocated to Port Macquarie in 1823, Newcastle was declared a free town, although many convicts remained to work in the mines and on the breakwater, and Elizabeth Hannell stayed on, assigned to government employment. The Aldine Centennial History of New South Wales provides information that Elizabeth's son Jesse came to Newcastle in 1823, which could have been when it became a free town. An old listing of members of the Legislative Assembly states that James Hannell also came to Newcastle as a child, so presumably John came as well. The boys attended the cathedral school. Interestingly, Elizabeth's three sons began using the family name of Hannell. They had been baptised with the surname of Walton, and an 1825 court case shows that Elizabeth was known by the name of Walton in Newcastle. Many people did change their names in the early years of the colony to distance themselves from past misdeeds or the convict stain. And the great-great-great-grandson of John Hannell believes they changed their name because they wanted to sever ties with their father, who had a bad reputation. Now, in 1825, Elizabeth, who was familiarly known as Betsy Walton, though I can't get myself into the habit of calling her Betsy, she got herself into more trouble with the law, which, as I said, means newspaper reports extremely beneficial to historians. She was charged with being an accessory to robberies carried out by a George Smith, who was an employee of Reverend Middleton at the parsonage. In court, convict Margaret Lawrence gave evidence. She said, about 2 months ago, Betsy Walton came to my house at night and asked me to go out with her. She took me to the parsonage. Mr. and Mrs. Middleton were away. They had a property at Patterson's Claims. Margaret said, we found a supper prepared by George Smith. Boiled fowls, pickled pork, vegetables, milk, and a bottle of wine, which I think was quite an impressive spread for the times. After supper, Smith and Walton retired to Mrs. Middleton's bedroom. But they're only absent under a quarter of an hour. When they came back, Margaret Lawrence testified that Elizabeth had a piece of striped muslin, which she had since used as trimming on a gown. Elizabeth declared that she bought the muslin in the marketplace of Sydney about 10 months previously. Anyway, George Smith was found guilty of various robberies, but he was also found guilty of harbouring improper persons at unreasonable hours at a parsonage. He was sentenced to 50 lashes and returned to his forgiving master, while the improper Elizabeth Hannell was sentenced to transportation to Port Macquarie. The sentence must have been changed back to assignment in Newcastle because she continued living in the town. Now, the court case provides evidence that Elizabeth could sew, as was most women could in those times, and was making use of the shortage of women to trade sex for rolls of material, which were not only expensive, but probably in short supply. In 1826, Elizabeth Hannell was again in court, but this time to give evidence about sexual assault of her little Mary Ann, who was only barely 5 years old. Elizabeth stated, on Saturday morning, I discovered on examining the linen of my little girl that she was in a very bad state from a serious injury she had sustained, and asked her what had caused it. She showed me the house where it happened and pointed out Atkinson. She told me I was away at the time drawing rations and that Atkinson had whipped her before he made the attempt. William Cooper gave evidence. He said, on Saturday last, I was in the skilling adjoining to that where Atkinson lives, and I saw the little girl crying. She informed me that someone had been hurting her. Cooper formed an impression that Atkinson had been doing something wrong with the child. A doctor who examined Marion found a considerable degree of inflammation and heavy discharge arising from the violence of the private parts. He also examined Atkinson, who he found was not diseased. After hearing all the evidence, the magistrate decided that Thomas Atkinson was not guilty of the offence because he was not diseased. And now this to me is a very upsetting case which suggests that Atkinson did interfere with Marianne, even though the magistrate found otherwise. And it certainly proves that Newcastle in those years was not a safe place for young girls. Now, the same year, 1826, Elizabeth Hannell applied to marry John Butler Hewson, who had arrived in Sydney aboard the convict ship Mangles in 1820, and who was a constable in the Newcastle district. But Reverend Middleton refused to publish the marriage bans because he considered Elizabeth a very bad character. As her descendant Del Foster surmised, what really must rankle the Reverend was the idea of Elizabeth sullying his wife's bed. Middleton, remember, had also baptised Elizabeth's daughter to John White, so would have considered her a very loose woman. But he must have finally relented because on the 28th May 1828, 2 years later, at Christchurch, Elizabeth Hannell, by then about 36, married John Hewson, who was about 9 years younger than her, but she had said she was a few years younger than she actually was. And by then, Hewson obtained his certificate of leave. Now, Hewson was literate and signed the marriage certificate, while Elizabeth could only make her mark. He became an affectionate stepfather to Elizabeth's 4 children, and they never had any of their own. In 1832, Hewson was appointed jailer at Newcastle Jail. And in October that year, 40 women were transferred to the jail from the Parramatta Female Factory in order to give the unmarried men in the district an opportunity to select wives. The Colonial Secretary, Alexander McLean, decided that to cater for the extra women, a decent woman was needed to act in the capacity of matron. On his suggestion, the jailer's wife, Elizabeth Hannell Hewson, was appointed matron. Could she be considered a decent woman? As Christine McCabe points out in Women of the Newcastle Female Factory, Elizabeth Hewson had a more serious criminal record than most of the charges. So perhaps the authorities did not realise that Elizabeth Hewson, Elizabeth Hannell, Elizabeth Walton was the same person. But the Hewsons were not there for long. They resigned in mid-1835 to take over the Union Inn, which was on the corner of today's Hunter and Bolton Streets, just across from the old post office. Now, Elizabeth's daughter, Marianne, married in 1838 to a widower, Job Hudson, a builder, formerly of Sydney, who had moved north when he won a contract for the erection of military barracks in Newcastle. Marianne's earlier problems with her private parts did not affect her fertility, and she began bearing a child every year. Now, Elizabeth's oldest son, James Hannell, at age 20, followed his father and stepfather's footsteps and joined the constabulary before becoming the district's first auctioneer in 1836. He again followed his stepfather's lead in also becoming a publican, taking over the ship in Perkins Street in 1840. James was appointed a justice of the peace, who often served as a magistrate. And when the town was declared a municipality in 1859, which he helped act, he was elected as the first mayor. He served as a member of the New South Wales Legislative Assembly for 3 terms. And the Newcastle Hospital became a consuming cause of him and his son Clarence. And through their fundraising, a new hospital wing was constructed and named the Hannell Wing. Elizabeth's other 2 sons, remember now they're all Hannells, also joined the police force. John Hannell was appointed Chief Constable at Newcastle in 1841. However, in 1842, he was granted a publican's licence for the Wheatsheaf Arms on the Hunter River at Hexham, which was to become the changing post for the Maitland to Newcastle coaches. He became a very wealthy publican and landowner. The youngest brother, Jesse, took over the job of Chief Constable when John became a publican, and was also appointed Inspector of Distilleries, responsible for closing down a rash of illicit distilleries. And in 1859, Jesse Hannell became the first lighthouse keeper at Nobbins. The sons all grew to be very big like their father and very stout. In fact, James Hannell, the one that became a member of the Legislative Assembly, was the stoutest man in the Assembly when he was a member. Now, there's many more accounts of the numerous civic activities of Elizabeth's sons, and they're easily traced if anyone's interested. Now, in 1842, after giving up the Union Inn licence, Elizabeth's husband, John Hewson, became the short-lived licensee of both the Governor Gibbs Hotel at Wollongong and the Rose and Crown in York Street, Sydney. But around that time, there was a drought, bad drought, and a downturn in the pastoral industry. It sent New South Wales into a depression. And also the Wollongong Hotel was close to the Great North Road, which was recently constructed, which ended up not getting the number of people using it because there were a lot of bushrangers, made it a dangerous place. Anyway, Hewson very quickly claimed insolvency due to debts totalling nearly, he said, £1,000. The New South Wales government disputed this claim, and some of Hewson's statements in the Constituent Court case give insights into the family finances. I do not recollect telling anyone that Mrs. Hewson had placed £700 in one of the Sydney banks, he stated, or that the money had been paid into the bank in the name of Mrs. Hannell. She never told me she had more than 4 or 5 sovereigns. One of the creditors attested that Mrs. Hewson had said she wouldn't part with her gold or sovereigns for God Almighty himself. Now, Hewson said that his wife had been living with Mr. Hudson of Newcastle, and before that she lived with one or other of the 2 publican sons. So they had plenty of choice of residents. And he swore that the James Hannell, his stepson, had not given him a promissory note for £100 and insisted he was living upon money his stepdaughter, Mrs. Hudson, had sent to her mother, who had forwarded to him. In other words, it's very complicated. Now, the Chief Commissioner concluded that although the case was suspicious, indeed, the Hewsons were seen at the theatre during the trial, the Commissioner had to say that not enough evidence had been elicited upon which he could commit Hewson for fraudulent insolvency, although he was morally satisfied that he had concealed property. That the case, as well as, propensity to maybe thieving or lying or whatever, it does show us the growing affluence of the Hewsons and Hannells. In 1843, Elizabeth was finally granted an absolute pardon. But soon after, a disaster struck the family. Mary Ann's husband, Job Hudson, had developed intemperate habits. And in August 1848, while on board a barque sailing from Newcastle to New Zealand and drinking to excess, he jumped overboard and drowned. Or he'd fallen. So Mary Ann was widowed. She had 5 children at that time. She had another 4 later, 2 sons. And the youngest was only 3 months old. So she would have required a lot of support from her mother. Meanwhile, John Hewson purchased land opposite the railway terminus at Honeysuckle Point, which is near the now closed civic station, and built a new Union Inn. Elizabeth must have been helping him to manage it because in 1855 he advertised the inn in full trade for lease and gave the reason in the paper that his wife was in ill health. Elizabeth, however, managed to live for over 20 more years. And we do know that Mary Ann helped look after her and John in the later years of their lives. Now, her husband, Elizabeth's husband, John Hewson, who I think brought order and affluence to her life, died in January 1874, and only 3 months later, Elizabeth, described as a colonist of 60 years standing and a 40-year resident of Newcastle, died herself at her residence in New Common Street, between Scotland and King Street, at the age of 80. Notwithstanding the heavy rain, her remains were followed to the grave by a large funeral cortege. Now, Elizabeth was buried with her husband in lot 112, Christchurch Cathedral. So if you're standing at the back of the cathedral and where all the burial part, close by is where John Hewson and Elizabeth Hannell are buried. Now, Elizabeth's grandson, Edward Hewson Hudson, filed her death certificate and seemingly did not know the names of her children. I wondered what had happened to the close family links of earlier years, or did the Hannell sons ask to be left off the certificate to hide their connection to a former convict? When James Hannell died, there was no mention of his mother in the lengthy obituaries, nor was his convict heritage mentioned in any 19th or early 20th century articles about the first mayor of Newcastle. It was not until, the 90s and 70s and 80s when convict ancestry began to be perceived less as a stain and more as a source of pride that his mother was again included in his story. And I think Dell Foster found that when she was starting to talk about the family history, some of the descendants did not want to believe there'd been convicts. They did not want to know about it. But I think there's a descendant of Elizabeth Hannell here today, who I was fortunate to meet a little while ago, and she seems quite proud to have had Elizabeth Hannell as some of her forebears. I didn't actually count up. I mean, Jane, John and Jessie, so they were all Hannells. They had a few children amongst them. Mary Ann ended up having 9 children, but they were 8 of them boys, they were Hudsons. So there would be a lot of descendants. Now, Mary Ann Hudson died only 5 years after her mother, and she bequeathed to her son Edward an oil painting of Elizabeth. For me, that painting, although sadly long lost, is a symbol of the progress of Elizabeth Hannell from multi-convicted young woman to an asset-owning member of the nouveau riche, colonial middle class. And I mean, she and her children would never have had the same opportunities back in England. And because of the contribution of her family and their many descendants, I believe that Elizabeth Hannell Hewson, transported convict, should be acknowledged as one of the mothers of present-day Newcastle. Thank you.
Elizabeth Hannell's story reminds us that history is often shaped not just by governors and generals, but by the determination of ordinary women, pushed to the margins, yet destined to survive. There are many more stories to tell of our felonious females, and we'll continue to bring them to life in this podcast series. For a comprehensive record of the convict women who came from Sydney to Newcastle and the Hunter, you may like to view They Sent Me North, available for download from our online shop at www.nfhs.org.au. Thanks for joining us on Newcastle Family History Society Podcasts.